the great honor and privilege to introduce Professor Joshua Levy, 94 years young, who will discuss the roots of the Levy family and the connection to Lithuania.
In my mother, my grandmother, Ita Hirsch, originally her maiden name was Ita Malamed, was born in Trishik, or to give it its modern Lithuanian name, Triskai, and she came to South Africa as a young girl, I'm confusing her with my mother. My grandmother was born in Triskai in 1871.
Triskia being in Lithuania?
Triskai is in the Kovna Gubernor of Lita. Yeah. The Kovna province of Lithuania, specifically in the Shovel district of Shovel.
Did you ever hear of a town where my grandmother came from, Mariampol?
I've heard of it.
It could have been very close. That's also in the province, south of Kovno. I think
Let's see if it's on the map.
Did your grandmother often speak about her experiences growing up in Lita?
She recorded it all, and that's why I've got this.
How did she record it?
In 19... as I said, she was born in 1871. At the age of something like 24, she married my grandfather in Lithuania, and they then proceeded to settle down in Shovel, where they produced my grandfather had a previous wife. He and his previous wife settled in Shovel, and the previous wife died after having given birth to 6 sons, and he then married my grandmother in 1895 or 96, and they came out to South Africa immediately after the end of the Boer War. The Boer War, well, not immediately, but the Boer War ended in 1902, and they came in 1904. He and his here is the map of Lithuania, and there is Trishik, right up in the north.
Oh, it's in the north, okay.
Trishik with the arrow pointing to it.
Okay. And when they came to South Africa, they came via Cape Town?
Yes.
By boat?
By
obviously
boat.
by boat.
Yes.
And did they settle, where did they settle when they came to South Africa?
They went immediately up north. In the meantime, my grandfather had come in advance and acquired a house in Ellsberg, which is just south of Germiston, and the children grew up there. Now, that's why my mother matriculated at the Germiston Central School, because from Ellsberg she had to go to school in Germiston.
And did they speak Yiddish at home?
They spoke Yiddish at home, but the home was a dynamo of Jewish education, discussion, knowledge. It was encyclopedic. Both my grandfather and my grandmother were remarkable students, more remarkable people. They were both writers. My grandfather was a contributor to overseas papers at that time. He was a great friend of Sokolov, who was the editor of a Hebrew newspaper published in Warsaw by the name of Hatzfira. And my grandfather was his South African correspondent. And after his first wife died, my grandfather, who was looking around for another wife, said, I want to marry a woman who knows Hebrew. And my grandmother fitted the bill. And she became herself a remarkable Hebrew scholar. She became head of the Talmud Torah in Bertram's in Johannesburg. At the age of 80, she sat down to write her memoirs of her life in Lithuania. And of all things, she decided to write in Hebrew. She could easily have written in English or in Yiddish, but she decided to record her memoirs in Hebrew. I fortunately got them. They were published in a Hebrew journal that was published in Johannesburg at that time, in the 1980s. It was called Barkai. Barkai.
That was the main Hebrew publication, yeah. It is,
and the author was a fanatical Hebraist and Zionist, and I think he bullied her and persuaded her that she should write in Hebrew, because he knew she could, and she did. So I've got that actually in a copy of it, and I published it here at the back of the book. And so I've got here both the English translation of her Hebrew.
We can see the
and
a childhood in
the background is an 1880 map of Lithuania, contemporary with my grandmother's residence there. Now.
And you put the book, you published the book, you put it together?
first thing I did was to get, you see, here are the pages from Barkai, 1957, from the 1950s, and I got them translated into English. The translation into English was done by a relative, Joshua Jacobson, who was my grandmother's nephew. Or great nephew.
And would your grandparents speak to each other in Hebrew at home or Yiddish?
Both.
Both. And they taught you Hebrew as well, growing up?
To a certain extent, yes. My grandfather, I did have some Hebrew lessons with my grandfather.
And can I ask, with regard to your grandfather, being a correspondent for the newspaper, did he correspond in Hebrew or Yiddish?
In Hebrew.
And I'm sure part of his assignment was to relate the conditions of South Africa to the Jews living in Eastern Europe.
That's exactly right. That's exactly right. That he used to send dispatches back to Lithuania to Sokolov to publish in his journal his findings in South Africa. And what he did was he provided
So this is a first-hand eyewitness account of the conditions of South Africa for potential people to move to South Africa when the gates to Palestine were closed and Jews couldn't go to Palestine, to the Holy Land.
Just put yourself into the position there.
It's amazing.
The situation in Russia for Jews was completely untenable. It was deprivation of the greatest degree. After the death of Alexander, you remember a bomb was put under his carriage.
Yeah.
Not by Jews, by revolutionaries, but the Jews were blamed for it. And this was in 1880 or 1881. The most terrible pogrom started in Europe against the Jews. Jews were massacred everywhere, especially in Eastern Europe. And young people realized that there was no future for them anymore, that they would never be accredited with rights, with citizenship. They would always be an inferior minority, and they started to look for something else. The vast majority saw their future in America. They went westwards. But it was the writings of my grandfather that persuaded quite a number to go south instead of west. And in fact, he is accredited with being the influence that persuaded a great many of South African Jews to come to South Africa instead of going westwards towards...
The book, this is related in the book that you
Absolutely.
It's called, if we can look at the cover.
Mayor David Hirsch, brand pioneer.
So can I just relate something, Prof?
Yeah.
My grandparents have a very similar situation where they were very Zionistic in Mariupol. They were in education. The grandfather was a principal of the school. He sent his wife with my grandmother and her siblings to Jaffa in the time of the Turks, and the intention was that he would join her at the first Hebrew gymnasium in Jaffa. But with the outbreak of the war and the Turks, they were deported back to Lithuania. And when I went to Lithuania last year, people said, "Did you look for the home?" They never had a home because they were renting, because they never felt that that was their home. Mariupol was never a permanent place for them. They always felt that their home was in Israel, in the Holy Land. But when the British closed the gates and they couldn't get there, so the next option was to come to South Africa. And it could have been through your grandfather that was very instrumental with his writings that convinced, because my great-grandparents read Hebrew and spoke Hebrew at home, they could have convinced them and many others to come south and to go to South Africa and to join other Litvaks who were living in South Africa.
Can I just read you what I've
I've
got here at the back? Mayor David Hirsch came to Johannesburg from Yanishoq in 1891. A brilliant Hebraist, he was correspondent for the famous Hebrew newspaper Hatzfira, edited by Nachum Sokolov in Warsaw. His dispatches in a stylish Hebrew were very widely read in the period of settlement of Tsarist Russia, and in particular in Kovna province of Lithuania. It was his accounts of Jewish life and opportunities in the burgeoning young new mining town that greatly influenced and was largely responsible for so many fellow Litvaks making the decision to immigrate south to Africa instead of west to America. His descriptions of the freedom and abundant opportunities available for Jews in the Transvaal more than 100 years ago, contrasting vividly with the repression and poverty which prevailed under the Russian regime, made the new country seem in comparison like a Garden of Eden. His stories of the successes of men like Sammy Marks, a fellow Litvak, and many others created a sensation amongst his impoverished Jewish brethren in Eastern Europe. His writings constitute a valuable historical record of the early years of the South African Jewish community. This record has been embedded for a century in the pages of an Eastern European Hebrew newspaper. They have been diligently sought for and retrieved by the compiler of the book from the archives of the Judaica section of the National and Hebrew University Library in Jerusalem, where they are stored on microfilm. Most of the articles have been translated into English for the first time and thus made available to a non-Hebrew reading public. The book rescues them from inevitable oblivion. I went personally to the Hebrew University Library and I unearthed these sheets that were on microfilm, and I had them photocopied and took them back to South Africa and had them translated into English. And that produced a lot of material.
Can we see the cover of the book? Prof, if we can, just for our viewers, because this book should be in every South African Jewish home. It's remarkable. It is something.
Here is my grandfather.
So your grandfather has the great zchut, the great honor, and the great privilege in that, knowing that so many Jewish families were rescued that left Lithuania, survived, and made new lives in South Africa, remained very close to the tradition, remained very Zionistic, the vast majority did not assimilate and remained orthodox and remained very close to the culture, and many have made aliyah. So we are really indebted to your grandfather.
Yes, I think that's correct.
That is something I can say now, after hearing this for the first time, and I am blown over, 99.99% sure that my great-grandparents, they read the articles in Hebrew, and I'm sure it's because of those articles they were convinced to go to South Africa.
Could well have
We
been the case.
never understood why would they go to South Africa. Part of the family went to
Yes.
America,
Yes.
and they came to South Africa. Their heart was always to go to Israel, but
Yes.
it was impossible because of the British White Paper, and they landed in South Africa, and now it's like a circle. I can actually understand
Yes.
the reasons why
But
they came to
you've
South
got to
Africa.
go further back. You see, that's later. This is the period before 1904. Young Jews in Eastern Europe knew nothing about South Africa. They had no idea,
Yeah.
no conception. Where is it? What is it? What can we do there? How do we live? How do we make a living? My grandfather provided them with what you might call a Baedeker. A Baedeker is a guidebook. A Baedeker telling them, if you want to come to South Africa, if you're a tinsmith, you need this and this tool. If you're a carpenter, you need this and this tools. If you haven't got these tools, acquire them and bring them with you. And so he showed them the way, what to do if they're coming. And his articles were published in Eastern Europe and provided these young people with a motivation and with a decision-making motivation to go to join fellow co-religionists in that part of the world. Here is an article by him that was published, Our Jewish Brethren in South Africa, by Meir David Hirsch. So he describes Johannesburg and its economic life, and he talks about the economic occupation of the Jews, what they do. He talks about speculators in stocks and shares, brokers, merchants who buy and sell wholesale, barkeepers or hotel keepers, produce stores, shopkeepers, traders in town and along the whole stretch of the gold and coal mines. The largest number are our brethren from Russia, Poland and Lithuania, from Eastern Europe. 2 years ago, or even 1 year ago, these people were very successful in their businesses. But recently, so many shops have opened that they are up that every mine, even the smallest, has as many as 7 shops. And butcher shops, kafir eating houses. These are restaurants for the blacks. They were called kafir eating houses. Cafes, shops selling drinks of tea or coffee or cocoa, fruit shops, bakeries and confectionaries, jewelry shops. Then there were tochers, peddlers in merchandise. These are all our fellow countrymen, and some of them have done very well. Peddlers, these are the petty traders who carry goods on their backs, even though this work is not by any means easy, it nevertheless brings good reward, for everywhere the peddler goes he sells his goods more or less. Poultry and eggs, second-hand clothes dealers, Jewish bookshops, artisans, artisans are very much needed here. They live well and are happy in their craft. They are mostly families from Eastern Europe, being metal sheet workers, blacksmiths, tailors, boot makers, watchmakers, sewing machine mechanics, who also repair bicycles, iron and woodworkers engaged in the building trade, bricklayers, etc. And there are a few professionals, a few Jewish doctors. Some of them are hailing from Eastern Europe. A few of them make money because their expenses are very high. And generally the supply exceeds the demand. There are many pharmacists.
And you have pictures as well. You have...
Oh yes. Yes, Johannesburg in 1888.
Prof, can I ask you, for all our listeners out there and all our ex-South Africans and South Africans, we owe a great debt to your grandfather. Did you get the acknowledgement, or was it known within the community what a service he provided and how he gave a guide to make it possible that people could realize their dreams and actually he saved so many families from giving them hope and direction and a practical ways of how to succeed in South Africa, in a foreign country. When you were growing up, did people acknowledge the tremendous contribution that he gave to South African Jewry?
It's hard to say. I'm not sure. I can't really be sure.
When people came from Eastern Europe, mainly from Lithuania, would they come to your grandfather and thank him for the service that he provided, for the insights that he gave?
So, no.
That's a pity, because it's absolutely remarkable and incredible what he did. He gave such a tremendously important...
Here is a page from Hatsvira.
Now, can I ask, with this book, which now I'm sure most people who watch this will want to obtain, is it possible to obtain this book? Can one buy it? Is it freely available?
It isn't, I'm afraid.
Could it be republished?
It might be possible, yeah.
Well, Prof, there are really no words to thank you for giving us such an insight into the...
There's so much here that it would...
This is an invaluable book, and it's an invaluable...
This is a very valuable source book.
For sure, and it's part of Jewish South African history, and
yes.
I think all South African Jewry are indebted.
Yes.
And I'm sure this is a book that needs to be republished, and it needs to be in the homes of all South African Jewry, and for South Africa, for the history of South Africa as well, because the impact that South African Jews had on the country is far beyond its numbers, and they made a tremendous contribution to South Africa and to world Jewry as well. Many tremendous South African Jews have come out from South Africa and have played a tremendous contribution in many different fields. Prof, I want to thank you so much. There are no words to describe.
It's been a pleasure.
Great appreciation. your insights, your clarity,
There's
the
so
work
much,
that you've done in bringing
there's
this.
so much more to discuss.
Well, for a future time we will, and I really want to thank you very, very much, and I'm sure our listeners, our viewers are going to really appreciate this very valuable interview that we've done. Thank you very, very much.
It's been a pleasure.
Prof. Levy, these are the books that you self-published.
Correct. Some of them.
Well, I really believe that these books should be republished. They are an invaluable source of Jewish history, and please God, it's a project that we should work on, that some of these books should be in every South African Jewish home. Thank you, Prof.